The sound reached them first, cutting through even the constant thunder of the artillery. It was a roar unlike anything Takahashi had heard before, not the sharp crack of explosive detonation, but something deeper and more visceral, like the breath of some enormous predatory beast. Then came the hissing, a sound that set every nerve on edge, the kind of sound that triggered instincts buried deep in the human brain, instincts that screamed danger in a language older than words. One of the younger soldiers, a boy barely 19 who had been conscripted from a farming village in Kyushu, whimpered and pressed himself against the far wall of the chamber. Before Takahashi could bark an order for silence, before he could even fully process what his ears were telling him, the fire came. It came not as a single blast, but as a flowing, living thing that poured through the firing slit that opened onto the slope above. The flame was a liquid river of orange and yellow, shot through with veins of white heat so intense that it hurt to look at directly. It spread across the ceiling of the bunker like some obscene parody of water, defying gravity, clinging to the rock as it advanced. The temperature in the chamber spiked instantly, and Takahashi felt the air itself become hostile, felt his lungs protest as he tried to draw breath. The screaming began then, high and terrible, as men nearest the entrance found their uniforms igniting, as the flames found exposed skin and hair. The howling was barely human, reduced to pure animal terror and agony. Takahashi threw himself to the floor, his training taking over, even as his mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. He crawled desperately toward the rear exit of the bunker, his eyes streaming from the smoke that was now filling the chamber with poisonous speed. Behind him, he could hear his men thrashing and screaming, could smell the sickening stench of burning cloth and burning flesh. The smoke was worse than the flames in some ways, thick and black and choking, stealing the oxygen from the air faster than a man could breathe. Takahashi's lungs burned as he gasped for air that wasn't there, his vision narrowing to a tunnel as consciousness began to slip away. He clawed at the volcanic soil beneath him, his fingers scraping uselessly at the unyielding stone. And in that moment of absolute helplessness and terror, a realization crashed over him with the weight of certainty. All their preparations, all their careful defenses, all the assurances from their commanders that the tunnels would keep them safe had been rendered meaningless. The Americans had brought with them a weapon against which courage meant nothing, against which the strongest fortifications offered no protection. The flamethrower had come to Iwo Jima, and with it came a new kind of warfare that transformed the very concept of defense into a cruel illusion. For the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army entrenched across the island, the arrival of the flamethrower represented more than just a tactical challenge. It was a weapon that struck at the very foundation of their defensive doctrine, that undermined the psychological fortress they had constructed to endure the hell of battle. The strategy that Kuribayashi had devised, and that every man on the island had been drilled in, was brutally simple in its logic. The Americans had superiority in numbers, in ships, in aircraft, in artillery. They could not be defeated in a conventional battle, could not be driven back into the sea as the propaganda broadcasts from Tokyo insisted was possible. But they could be bled. They could be made to pay such a terrible price for every foot of ground that the American public would lose its will to continue. The tunnels and bunkers and caves were the means to this end. From these positions, Japanese soldiers could survive bombardments that would annihilate men caught in the open. They could wait out the shelling, then emerge to man their weapons when the Marines advanced. Artillery and bombs could only do so much against an enemy who lived beneath the earth. Naval guns could pulverize the surface, but the men underground would endure, would survive, would continue to fight. This was the theory that had sustained morale through weeks of preliminary bombardment, through the terrifying days when it seemed that the entire island would be blasted into the sea by the weight of explosives raining down from ships and planes. What the defenders had failed to anticipate, what their intelligence services had not adequately conveyed despite reports from other battles in the Pacific, was the development and deployment of a weapon specifically designed to negate the advantage of fortifications. The Americans called it the M2 flamethrower, a designation that conveyed nothing of its terrible effectiveness. The device was carried on the back of a single Marine, a pair of tanks containing approximately 7 gallons of fuel mixture connected to a handheld nozzle by reinforced hoses. The fuel itself was the key to the weapon's devastating impact. Early in the war, flamethrowers had used ordinary gasoline, but gasoline flowed too quickly, splashed too easily, and dissipated too fast. The weapon had been dangerous to its operator and of limited effectiveness against prepared positions. But then chemists at Harvard University, working under government contract, had developed a solution. They created napalm, a thickening agent that when mixed with gasoline produced a gel that stuck to whatever it touched. This jellied fuel could be projected in a stream up to 40 yards, could splash around corners and obstacles, could cling to walls and ceilings and human flesh. When ignited, it burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to crack concrete, hot enough to consume the oxygen in an enclosed space and suffocate men who were never directly touched by the flames themselves. The Japanese soldiers had a name for it that captured their terror and revulsion. They called it Jigoku no Hai, the fires of hell, and the name was more than mere rhetoric. For men trapped in bunkers and caves, the arrival of flame through a firing slit or ventilation shaft was the beginning of a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The fire moved with an intelligence that seemed almost malevolent, seeking out every corner and crevice, flowing upward along walls, spreading across ceilings in defiance of natural law. A single burst from a flamethrower, lasting perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, could transform a reinforced pillbox into a crematorium. The concrete walls that had withstood direct hits from naval shells offered no protection. Indeed, they became part of the weapon's effectiveness, trapping the heat and smoke, turning the defensive position into a tomb. Even the strongest bunker, even the most carefully prepared fighting position with thick walls and narrow embrasures, became a death trap once flame entered. One squirt through the gun slit, and the entire interior would be engulfed, the air itself becoming flame, the temperature spiking to levels that could cook a man even if the fire never touched his skin. The numbers from Iwo Jima tell a story of systematic destruction. The Marines who came ashore on that black volcanic beach brought with them over 3,000 portable flamethrowers. This represented a massive commitment to a single weapon system, a clear indication that American commanders understood exactly what they would be facing on the island. But the portable units, devastating as they were, represented only part of the flame-throwing arsenal. The Marines also deployed tanks specially modified to carry and project flame, vehicles that became objects of particular dread among the Japanese defenders. The M4A3R3 Sherman tank, fitted with a naval Mark I flamethrower system, was nicknamed the Zippo by the Marines who operated it, a sardonic reference to the popular cigarette lighter. These armoured behemoths carried 290 gallons of napalm fuel and could project streams of fire out to distances of 150 yards. The effect of these weapons on the battlefield was transformative. A single Zippo tank could sweep an entire hillside with flame, could systematically work its way along a trench line or cave entrance, could reduce defended positions to charred ruins in minutes. The Japanese soldiers who had been trained to respect and fear conventional tanks found these flame-throwing variants infinitely worse. A regular tank might kill with shell or machine gun, deaths that were at least quick and comprehensible. But the flame tanks promised something else entirely, a death that was slow and agonizing, that left men burning alive with no possibility of quick release. Marine engineers who operated these vehicles gave them another nickname that spoke to their terrible effectiveness. They called them Satan's Shermans, and the name stuck. The crews who manned these tanks understood the psychological impact of their weapons. Japanese soldiers who might have stood their ground against conventional armour, who might have attempted to disable or destroy a standard tank with magnetic mines or satchel charges, fled in panic from the approach of a flame tank. The mere rumour that such a vehicle was approaching a defensive sector could cause entire units to abandon their positions, to retreat deeper into the tunnel networks in desperate search of safety that often did not exist. One aspect of the flamethrowers' deployment on Iwo Jima that has received less attention in historical accounts but which represented a crucial innovation was the widespread use of napalm fuel. This was among the first battles in the Pacific War where napalm was employed on such a massive scale in ground combat. The development of napalm had occurred relatively recently in the war's timeline. In early 1942, a team of chemists led by Louis Fieser at Harvard had been tasked with finding a way to make gasoline stick to targets and burn longer. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity. They mixed gasoline with aluminum naphthenate and palmitate, creating a gel that could be stored safely, but which became a deadly weapon when ignited and projected. The name napalm came from the key ingredients, naphthenate and palmitate, a prosaic designation for a substance that would terrorize defenders across the Pacific and later in other conflicts. The tactical advantage of napalm over ordinary gasoline was immediately apparent to anyone who witnessed its use. Regular gasoline, when used in early war flamethrowers, would splash and flow like water, often running harmlessly past defended positions or dissipating before it could inflict significant damage. Worse, it posed a serious danger to the operator, as a broken fuel line or ruptured tank could instantly engulf the flamethrower operator in burning liquid. Napalm solved these problems with ruthless efficiency. The gel form meant that the fuel could be projected in a cohesive stream, could be directed with precision against specific targets. When it struck a surface, it adhered, clinging with terrible persistence. Water could not extinguish it. Attempts to brush it off only spread the burning gel to new areas. Sand smothered it temporarily, but the gel would reignite as soon as oxygen reached it again. Men who survived flamethrower attacks described watching their comrades stagger from bunkers with napalm still burning on their uniforms and skin, the flames impossible to extinguish, the victims sometimes remaining alive and conscious for minutes of unbearable agony before shock and blood loss finally brought release. Marines who operated the flamethrowers carried their own burden of trauma from this work. One wrote in a letter home that has since been preserved in military archives that carrying the weapon felt like having hell itself strapped to his back, that he despised having to use it even as he understood that it saved the lives of his fellow Marines by eliminating positions that would otherwise have required costly frontal assaults. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders went beyond the immediate terror of the flames themselves. Diaries and letters recovered from dead soldiers after the battle ended provide haunting testimony to the despair that gripped men facing this weapon. One corporal whose diary was found clutched in his hands in a collapsed tunnel wrote with remarkable clarity about the impossibility of resisting. He described how the fire came into the caves and consumed the air itself, how men would choke and suffocate even before the flames reached them, how there was no way to fight back against an attack that required no direct exposure from the attackers. Another entry from a different soldier's diary described watching an entire platoon of 40 men wiped out in less than a minute when flame was directed into their bunker from 2 different angles simultaneously. The writer noted with bitter irony that these were brave men, veterans of campaigns in China and Manchuria, men who had faced death many times without flinching, but the fire had left nothing of them but ash and charred bone. The fundamental asymmetry of the weapon was clear to everyone who encountered it. Artillery bombardment could be endured. Men could huddle in the deepest parts of tunnels and wait out even the most intense shelling, knowing that unless a shell scored a direct hit on an entrance, they would likely survive. Bombing raids from aircraft were terrifying, but could be weathered. Even machine gun fire and rifle bullets, deadly as they were, operated according to rules that soldiers understood. You kept your head down, you used cover, you waited for your moment. But flamethrowers respected none of these conventions. The fire flowed like water but clung like tar. It came around corners and through the smallest openings. It filled enclosed spaces with heat and smoke that killed as surely as the flames themselves. Most crucially, it attacked the mind as much as the body, because every man in a bunker or cave knew that if the fire came, there would be no escape, no last-second dodge, no miraculous survival. The fire was patient and thorough and utterly merciless. The timeline of the battle itself reveals how quickly the flamethrower became central to American tactics on Iwo Jima. The Marines came ashore on the 19th of February in 1945, landing on beaches of black volcanic sand that gave way under their boots and made movement exhausting. From the very first hours, they encountered the kind of resistance that Kuribayashi had designed. Machine gun fire swept the beaches from concealed positions. Mortar rounds dropped with devastating accuracy into the packed ranks of Marines struggling to move inland. Artillery fire from positions on the heights pounded the shore, turning the landing zone into a killing ground. The initial advance measured in yards rather than miles, each foot of ground purchased with casualties that mounted sickeningly fast. Conventional weapons could suppress some positions temporarily, but the Japanese would simply retreat into their tunnels during bombardments, then re-emerge when the fire lifted to man their weapons again. The Marines found themselves caught in a nightmare of attrition, unable to advance without taking prohibitive casualties, unable to effectively neutralize positions that could withstand nearly any amount of conventional firepower. By the second day of the battle, as the grim arithmetic of the assault became clear, the call went out for flamethrowers. The flame teams moved forward, operators burdened with the heavy fuel tanks, protected as much as possible by riflemen who understood that the flamethrower operators were priority targets for Japanese snipers and machine gunners. The defenders had learned in previous battles that eliminating the flamethrower operator was worth almost any risk, as it could preserve a position for hours or even days longer. But the Marines had developed tactics to protect these valuable specialists, using smoke and suppressive fire to cover their approach. When the first flamethrower burst struck a Japanese pillbox that had been holding up an entire company's advance, the effect was immediate and decisive. Flame poured through the narrow gun slit, filled the interior of the reinforced concrete structure, and within seconds the position fell silent. No more machine gun fire, no more resistance. Just smoke rising from the embrasures and the sickly smell of burned flesh drifting across the volcanic sand. The Marines advanced past the position and continued their attack. Word spread quickly through the Japanese defensive network that the flame weapons had arrived, and with that knowledge came a fear that no amount of martial spirit or devotion to duty could entirely suppress. The tank-mounted flamethrowers appeared slightly later, but made an even more dramatic impact on the battlefield. On the 24th of February, the 4th Marine Division pushed toward a complex of defensive positions centered on a volcanic prominence that had been designated Hill 382 on American maps. The approaches to this position were covered by interlocking fields of fire from machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Previous assaults had been bloodily repulsed, with Marines pinned down in the open ground and suffering terrible casualties from defenders who remained safe in their bunkers. The solution came in the form of Sherman tanks equipped with the Navy's flamethrower system. These vehicles approached the hill with a deliberate, almost leisurely pace, their armour-proof against most of the weapons the defenders could bring to bear. When they reached effective range, the flames began. Long, arcing streams of burning napalm swept across the face of the hill, probing into cave entrances, washing over the concrete facades of pillboxes, reaching into spaces that conventional weapons could never touch. The spectacle was both mesmerizing and horrific. Witnesses described seeing Japanese soldiers burst from cave mouths, already fully engulfed in flame, human torches that ran a few desperate steps before collapsing. Others tried to crawl out of positions, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from supporting infantry, the Marines having learned that wounded defenders emerging from flame attacks could still pose a threat if they retained weapons. Japanese commanders, monitoring the situation from deeper positions, urged their men to commit suicide rather than face capture or the flames. Many followed these exhortations, detonating grenades inside their bunkers, choosing a quick death over the alternative. The Marines who advanced in the wake of the flame attacks developed a grim routine that was repeated hundreds of times across the island. Approach a fortified position, call up the flamethrower team or the flame tank. Apply fire until all resistance ceased. Move on to the next position. The efficiency was brutal but undeniable. Positions that might have held out for days under conventional assault fell in minutes once flame was employed. The statistical record of destruction on Iwo Jima tells a story almost beyond comprehension. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese soldiers and naval personnel defending the island, only about 200 survived to be taken prisoner. This represented a casualty rate of over 99%, a level of annihilation rarely seen in modern warfare. The vast majority of these men died in the tunnels and bunkers they had constructed, killed by a combination of flamethrowers, demolition charges, and systematic cave-sealing operations. Military historians analysing post-battle reports have estimated that flame weapons and explosive charges used to seal tunnel entrances together accounted for somewhere between 30 and 40% of all Japanese combat deaths during the battle. This percentage is staggering when one considers that it represents a single category of weapon out of the vast arsenal the Americans brought to bear. The defenders had spent months preparing for naval bombardment, for artillery, for tanks, for air attack. They had stockpiled ammunition and food, had created fallback positions and alternate routes through the tunnel networks. But they had no effective defense against fire that could penetrate their strongest positions and kill without even needing to strike directly. Another detail that has emerged from post-war research, but which was not widely known at the time, involved experimental weapons systems that the Navy tested on Iwo Jima. Several landing vehicles, the amphibious tractors that carried Marines from ship to shore, had been fitted with experimental flame-projecting equipment. The concept was to use these vehicles to clear the beaches ahead of the main infantry assault, burning out any defensive positions within range before the vulnerable troops were exposed. Mechanical problems and the confusion of the initial landing limited the actual deployment of these weapons, but their presence on the battlefield spoke to the American commitment to developing and employing fire as a primary weapon against fortified positions. Japanese prisoners interrogated after the battle, men who had somehow survived the carnage, universally cited the flamethrowers as the weapon they feared most. Some described how word of the flame tanks would spread through the tunnel networks even before the vehicles arrived, how men would begin abandoning positions based solely on rumour and panic. The testimony of these survivors revealed the extent to which the psychological impact of the weapons had undermined whatever remained of defensive cohesion in the final days of the battle. One captured officer, a major who had commanded a battalion defending a sector near the Motoyama airfield, stated in his interrogation that the fire weapons had destroyed not just bodies but spirits, that even the most dedicated soldiers found their courage evaporating when they knew that flames were approaching their position. The ripple effects of the flamethrowers' success on Iwo Jima extended beyond that single battle. In Tokyo, staff officers receiving reports from the island understood that they were reading descriptions of a fundamental shift in the nature of defensive warfare. One diary entry from a colonel working in the army ministry captured the dawning horror of this realization. He wrote that the Americans had brought fire into the earth itself, that there was no longer any safety in fortification, that the entire strategy of defense in depth that Japan had relied on to slow the American advance had been rendered obsolete. The implications for subsequent battles were obvious and terrifying. At Okinawa, which would be assaulted just weeks after Iwo Jima fell, Japanese defenders incorporated lessons learned from the Iwo Jima disaster. They dug secondary and tertiary exits from caves, hoping that multiple escape routes might allow them to flee when flamethrowers appeared. They attempted to create positions with better ventilation, though this often conflicted with the need to make bunkers resistant to conventional weapons. Some commanders stockpiled water, operating under the misconception that it might somehow extinguish napalm fires, only to discover through bitter experience that it did not experience that water was useless against jellied fuel. None of these measures proved effective. The flamethrower teams came to Okinawa as they had come to Iwo Jima, and the results were largely the same. The weapon's effectiveness did not blind American forces to its moral and practical costs. Marines who operated flamethrowers faced dangers that went beyond the obvious risk of carrying highly flammable fuel into combat. Enemy snipers and machine gunners had learned to target flamethrower operators as a matter of priority, understanding that eliminating these men could preserve defensive positions and buy crucial time. The distinctive silhouette created by the fuel tanks on an operator's back made these Marines easy to identify even at distance. Casualties among flamethrower teams were proportionally higher than among regular infantry, and yet there was never a shortage of volunteers. The men understood what was being asked of them, and they accepted it because they had seen firsthand how many lives the weapon saved, how many futile and bloody frontal assaults could be avoided by the judicious application of flame. Tank crews operating the Sherman Zippos faced their own unique hazards. The flame projector equipment made the tanks more vulnerable to enemy fire than standard Shermans, as the fuel tanks and projection apparatus provided additional weak points that could be exploited. Japanese artillery and anti-tank teams learned to focus on these vehicles, understanding that destroying a flame tank eliminated one of the most devastating weapons in the American arsenal. The crews accepted these risks with the same fatalistic courage as their infantry counterparts, knowing that their contribution to the battle could mean the difference between victory and slaughter. Yet despite the tactical necessity and the lives saved, many of the men who employed flamethrowers carried psychological scars from the work. Letters and memoirs written by veterans decades after the war reveal a recurring pattern of troubled conscience, of men who understood intellectually that they had done what was necessary, but who were haunted nevertheless by memories of burning men, of screams that echoed from bunkers, of the smell that accompanied the use of the weapon. One Marine wrote in his memoir, published in the 1980s, that he could still smell napalm when he closed his eyes at night, that the odour of burning fuel and burning flesh had somehow become permanently etched into his memory, that there were times when he would wake from nightmares seeing again the figures that had stumbled from caves wreathed in flame. The moral dimension of the weapon was not lost on senior commanders either. General Holland Smith, who commanded the Marine forces during the battle, made a statement after the island was secured that was both blunt and revealing. He said without any qualification that without flamethrowers the Marines could not have taken Iwo Jima, or at minimum could not have taken it without casualties that would have been unacceptable even by the grim standards of Pacific War combat. This was an extraordinary admission, an acknowledgement that a single weapon system had proven indispensable to victory, that all the other advantages in men and material might not have been enough without the ability to project flame into the fortifications where the enemy sheltered. For the Japanese survivors, those few who lived through the battle and the subsequent years of imprisonment, the legacy of the flamethrower was one of profound psychological trauma that went beyond even the physical wounds many carried. In post-war interviews conducted by researchers and historians, these men consistently described a sense of betrayal by the very earth that was supposed to protect them. They had believed absolutely in the invincibility of their underground fortifications, had been told by engineers and commanders that the tunnels could withstand anything the Americans might throw at them. The careful construction, the reinforced positions, the stockpiled supplies were all meant to create an impregnable defense that would allow them to fight for months if necessary. When the fire came, all of that careful preparation revealed itself as illusion. The tunnels became tombs, the bunkers became ovens, and the stone walls that were supposed to stop shells became the very means of their destruction by trapping heat and smoke. One soldier whose testimony was recorded in the 1960s, a man who had been severely burned but survived when his cave partially collapsed and allowed him to escape into the open, described the moment when he understood that there was no hope. He said the fire was like a demon with intelligence, that it moved as if it were hunting them, that it found every corner and every hiding place. He wrote in his statement that the fire ate stone in the sense that it penetrated stone, ate air by consuming oxygen, and ate men by burning them alive or suffocating them. For a culture and military tradition that placed enormous emphasis on spiritual endurance, on the power of will to overcome material disadvantage, the flamethrower represented an enemy against which no amount of courage or determination mattered. Chemistry and industrial capacity had created a weapon that rendered traditional martial virtues meaningless. The industrial dimension of the flamethrowers' deployment points to one of the fundamental asymmetries that characterized the Pacific War. By 1945, American factories were operating at a level of productivity that Japan could not hope to match. The production of flamethrowers and napalm fuel represented just one small fraction of the vast output of weapons and munitions, but even in this single category, the disparity was crushing. American plants were turning out tens of thousands of flamethrower units and producing millions of gallons of napalm fuel. The weapon had moved from experimental status to standard issue, with Marine divisions expecting to have flamethrowers as a routine part of their tactical arsenal. Meanwhile, Japan's industrial base, battered by bombing raids and strangled by naval blockade, was struggling to produce even basic small arms ammunition and replacement parts for existing equipment. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima faced not only superior numbers, but weapons systems that represented technological and industrial capabilities that their own nation simply could not match. This extended to every aspect of warfare on the island. American artillery could fire hundreds of thousands of rounds because the ammunition existed in seemingly unlimited supply. Marine infantry could call in air support from carriers offshore, strikes that arrived with devastating accuracy and overwhelming force. And when conventional weapons failed to reduce a position, the flamethrowers came, weapons whose very existence depended on a chemical industry capable of producing specialized fuels in enormous quantity. The battleground on for 36 days of continuous combat, a period that saw some of the most intense fighting in the entire Pacific campaign. By the time the island was declared secure in late March, nearly 7,000 American Marines and sailors had been killed and over twice that number wounded. The cost was staggering, a price paid in young lives that shocked even a nation grown accustomed to casualty lists from years of global war. But the Japanese losses were almost total. Of the 21,000 defenders, virtually all were dead, their bodies buried in the tunnels where they had fought or cremated by the weapons used to clear those positions. The handful of prisoners taken were mostly men too badly wounded to resist or who had been knocked unconscious and captured before they could take their own lives. In the final accounting, the battle for Iwo Jima stood as one of the bloodiest per square mile in the history of warfare. Among the surviving Japanese, both those few captured on the island and those who learned of the battle's details afterward, the memory that burned deepest was not of the shells or the bombs or the machine guns. It was the memory of fire, of flames that turned stone fortresses into death traps, of a weapon that had shattered their last illusions about the possibility of effective defense. Post-war interrogations of officers who had served on the island or who had received reports from it yielded consistent testimony. They spoke of how the flamethrower had destroyed morale, even among units that had not yet directly encountered it, how the mere knowledge that such a weapon existed and was being deployed systematically against defensive positions had undermined the psychological foundation of resistance. On that 23rd day of February, while the battle still raged across the island, a group of Marines fought their way to the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised an American flag in what would become one of the most iconic images of the entire war. Photographers captured the moment, and within hours the image was being transmitted around the world, a symbol of American determination and eventual victory. But beneath that summit, in the tunnels and chambers that honeycombed the volcanic mountain, other Marines were still at work with their flamethrowers. The defenders who remained in those depths, cut off and isolated, with no hope of relief or escape, continued to resist with the desperate ferocity of men who knew they were already dead. The flamethrower teams methodically cleared position after position, cave after cave, tunnel after tunnel. For the Japanese soldiers trapped in that underground darkness, there was no symbolic moment of triumph, no flag raising to mark the end of their struggle. There was only the roar as fuel ignited, the rush of heat as flame filled their chambers, and the choking smoke that stole away consciousness and life. The underground became a charnel house, a maze of death where the fire hunted men who had believed stone would protect them. In the final analysis, the Japanese command had planned for a battle of endurance and attrition. They had believed that by transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress, by creating defences so deep and so complex that they could not be easily reduced, they could exact a price in American blood that would force a reconsideration of the entire strategy of island hopping toward Japan itself. The plan was not without merit in its conception. The fortifications were indeed formidable. The defensive positions well sited and mutually supporting, the soldiers defending them prepared to die to the last man. What the planners had not adequately accounted for was the possibility that the Americans would develop and deploy a weapon that specifically targeted the strength of the defense, that turned the very fortifications into liabilities. The flamethrower proved to be exactly that weapon, a tool that combined terror and efficiency in equal measure, that exploited the enclosed nature of bunkers and tunnels to multiply its lethality. It was more than just another item in the arsenal, more than just one weapon among many. It represented the application of industrial chemistry to the problems of siege warfare, the creation of a substance and delivery system that could penetrate defences that were impervious to conventional munitions. The psychological dimension of the weapon cannot be overstated. Modern military doctrine recognizes that breaking an enemy's will to fight is often as important as destroying his physical capacity to resist. The flamethrower accomplished both objectives simultaneously. It killed with terrible efficiency, but it also induced a level of terror that could cause men to abandon positions before the weapon even arrived, to surrender or flee rather than face the flames. For the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army who experienced the hell of Iwo Jima, who watched their carefully constructed defences rendered meaningless by streams of jellied flame, the lesson was bitter beyond words. No wall was thick enough to stop the fire from finding a way in. No tunnel was deep enough to escape the heat and smoke that preceded the flames themselves. No amount of courage or devotion to duty could overcome the simple physical reality that a man cannot breathe superheated air, cannot survive in an atmosphere stripped of oxygen, cannot escape from a sealed chamber filling with fire. The weapon had proven that modern industrial warfare had entered a new phase, one in which technology could create tools of destruction that rendered traditional notions of defense obsolete. American fire, napalm fire projected from tanks and carried on the backs of Marines, had become a weapon against which there truly was no escape, no defense, no hope. The earth that was supposed to shelter the defenders had instead become their grave, and the fire had been the instrument of that transformation. The survivors carried that knowledge forward, carried the memory of what had been done to their comrades and what might have been done to them if fortune had placed them in different positions. It was a memory that would haunt Japanese military thinking for years to come, a recognition that the next war, if it ever came, would be fought with weapons that made the flamethrower seem almost primitive by comparison, weapons against which there might be no shelter at all.